So we're going to have a look at a rear-wheel drive transmission oil pump. This is out of a GM 4L60E, and this is what we refer to as a variable displacement pump. So I'm going to begin by taking this apart, and then I'm going to show you why it's a variable displacement pump and what the benefits of that are. So I'm going to remove the fixed stator portion of the pump from the pump body, and we are looking at the vane hydraulic pump. And what makes this a variable displacement pump is it has the ability to change its internal dimension, which changes the volume of fluid that we're pumping. Because when the transmission is hydraulically charged after the vehicle started, and we are engaged and we are driving, we no longer need to move a volume of fluid, we need to maintain pressure. So if we were pumping the same volume with every rotation and just returning it to the pan, that becomes an energy inefficiency. So in order to get this apart for the rebuild process, we have to remove this priming spring, and I'm going to use a large screwdriver for that. Then I am going to take out what we call the slide. And on the back side of the slide, you have an O-ring. And you have a wear ring down here. And a few little parts we have to keep track of. So we got a little spring there that goes underneath the hinge. That's the wear ring for the slide, and this is kind of stuck in place. And that's our seal, and that's our backer for our seal. And in a rebuild kit, we get those pieces. Most of the time, if the pump isn't damaged or worn, we can reuse the vanes. This transmission's went through a series of upgrades, and they talk about the number of vanes. And in the early ones, there was 8 of them, and then they went to 10, and I believe this would be, if I'm not mistaken, 13. So what we want to do is, because every time we start the transmission, the torque converter is laying on this bushing, this converter bushing, and it becomes what we call a dry start, and it tends to scuff the bushing. So we're going to look in here and make sure we have no unwanted wear or abnormal wear. We always replace the bushing. And we'll do that on the press. As far as the stator portion, same thing. We're going to look for unwanted wear in here. I can wash this in the dishwasher once it's disassembled, but I want to pull the valves out of the pump. So to pull the valves out of the pump, make sure you have it situated on something where it's not going to slide around on you. And I'll start with the pressure regulator valve. And I'm going to remove that snap ring. And of course, you should have safety glasses on when you do this so you don't get your eyes knocked out. And whenever you're taking valves out of a pump, valve body, etc., it's a good idea to lay them out in their linear order so that upon reassembly you don't get confused. And that is our pressure regulator valve. This is called our boost valve. It's our reverse boost valve, which boosts line pressure in reverse. And over here we have our torque converter clutch valve. I'm going to take that out as well. And that one's a little more challenging, but we'll get her. We're going to lay that out also. Oh, usually there's a new one in the kit. And the other thing is we have a pressure relief built into the pump, which is nothing more than a check ball and a spring. And it's a pretty heavy duty spring, so you want to make sure you keep track of that when you remove the pin. So at this point, we could wash this pump body also in the dishwasher. After it's washed, we're going to want to rinse that, make sure we get all the cleaning residue from the dishwasher off it, blow it dry, do a visual inspection. We've put our pump bushing in, and we are going to proceed with our reassembly. So we begin with putting this O-ring in here, and what this O-ring does is it's going to keep the wear ring or the sealing ring up tight against the pump body. Make sure you get that down in there. And I'm going to put a new Teflon seal, and we put the backer in there, which keeps the seal up against the pump body. I'm going to put that in place, and at this point I'm going to show you how this actually changes the size for the volume efficiency. So the little spring goes in, we put our hinge pin in, and I have my pump rotor. I'm going to put a little trans gel to hold this in place, and it only goes in there one way, but we got to find out which way that is. There we go. We also have these guides that keep the vanes up against the slide. If this is a used pump and I am putting it back together, I always want to try to put these in the way they came out. In other words, where these guides are, you will actually see little step wear on the vane. So I want to make sure that I don't have that flip, because those little steps would give oil a place to bypass the vane. So if I'm going to reuse them, I'm going to carefully inspect them. Or again, you can buy brand new ones in a pump kit, but in this case, everything looks good. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to reuse this. And I am going to proceed to put all of those vanes in place. And it helps to rotate that a little bit while you're doing it to get that. And if you look at the pump cavity, you'll see by moving the slide, I can slightly alter the size of the pump cavity between the inlet and the outlet, which changes the volume of oil that's pumped per rotation. So now I'm going to put the guide ring, the upper guide ring in. And the trick here is to get the spring in without losing it. So my method is kind of to use a flat blade screwdriver. There's a little bit of a ramp. Of course. guide that down there with your thumb. And we are ready. Okay, so at this point, we've cleaned and inspected everything. We've put our new Teflon rings on our fixed stator portion. We're going to reassemble our valves. We're going to put the two halves together. So I typically start with my relief, my pressure relief, and little trick is I'll use a screwdriver, make sure I'm on some kind of a surface that isn't sliding. Get that spring pushed down, get the pin started, and I'll work it the rest of the way. Now I'll put my torque converter TCC valve or torque converter clutch valve in, and I've got a little oil. And the one thing to be aware of is on snap rings, because a lot of times in the forming process they are die formed, so you'll have a rounded edge and you'll have a sharper flat edge. If the pressure is coming from underneath the ring, you want to make sure that that sharper flat edge is up top, because if the rounded edge was up top, when the pressure hits it, it can actually cause the snap ring to roll in, kick out, and the valve pop out. And that's especially true when we're talking about the pressure regulator valve where we have a heavier spring. So I'm going to get that set in there, and you want to make sure that you got valve movement and the snap ring is seated all the way. Then I'll go to my pressure regulator valve and I'll do the same thing. Put a little oil on it, drop it down in its bore. And the boost valve gets a little oil. And same thing, I'm going to look at this snap ring and I'm going to decide which is the flatter edge, and that is the sharper, flatter side versus the more rounded side. I'm going to make sure that the rounded side faces down against the pressure. I'm going to seat that, make sure the ring's seated, make sure the valve moves. Now I'll put my screen in, and I'm ready to assemble the two halves. So I like to look for the mating marks because you can only put this together one way and get the bolts to line up. Get all the bolts started. Because this pump sits in the transmission case into a machine bore, I need to make sure that the two halves are concentric and the holes are lined up as best as possible. So in order to facilitate that, I'm going to use a banding strap that I put on here, put it right on the seam. Finger tight works good. Run my bolts down. The torque spec for this pump is 18 to 20, so I've got the torque wrench preset. I'm going to follow a star pattern, just like I would putting a wheel on a car. This is not the place to use air tools or cordless impacts. And at this point, it's a good idea to take my pump assembly and put it inside of the corresponding torque converter, make sure everything rotates the way it's supposed to. Okay, so at this point we're all assembled. It's a good idea to put your pump index into the appropriate torque converter, make sure everything spins freely and your fit is good on the bushing. And you are ready to go.